Welcome everyone to a video I've been looking forward to doing this one for a while. I'm sitting in one of my favorite cars. It's a 1991 Bentley Turbo R. Now, the supercars are fun and everything, but I love a big old land yacht, especially one that's festooned in all this gorgeous walnut and leather. So, to me, this one is going to be a really special one. Before we get started, just a few things to go over. Obviously, those who are familiar with this car, 6.75 liter V8 up front, turbocharged with what Rolls-Royce used to call sufficient horsepower, but according to Motor Trend is a lot more like 300 horsepower and 490-ish pound-feet of torque. The original sticker price of this car was $195,000 in 1991, which is about $370 today. It was priced above the Mulsanne S and the Silver Spirit, but below the Silver Spur, so it was top of the line for Bentley, but not quite as much as the top of the line Rolls-Royce. In 91, Bentley switched from the 3-speed to the 4-speed, both GM transmissions. For the Turbo R, which incidentally means road holding, there are suspension changes, including a 50% increase in roll stiffness. Total production of the Turbo R was 5,864 units, and Motor Trend called it the first Bentley in decades to be worthy of the name. Those are my notes done, so let's get this thing out on the road and see if Motor Trend was right. I may have chosen the wrong time to say that. Still waiting for the traffic. And away we go. Now, the first thing you notice is the steering. If you've driven Rolls-Royces in the past or modern Bentleys, you know that the steering usually isn't terribly communicative. It's very light, very feathery. Not so in the Turbo R. There is an amount of weight to it. I suspect that is from the road holding model, that this is supposed to be a bit more of a driver-focused car, so they give you this weighted steering. You also notice that the throttle response is better than you would expect. Again, Turbo R. And the power is more than enough. It's not too much more than enough. You're not going to be doing massive burnouts without, doing a brake stand or something like that. But you certainly can get going. The other thing you notice if you've driven Rolls-Royce products in the past, it's not quite as pillowy, but it is certainly far more pillowy of a ride than any modern sporting sedan. And again, that makes sense because, as I mentioned before, the suspension was stiffened up to create this Turbo R. One of the other interesting things about this car is the true isolation you feel in it. I tend to be a pretty quick driver. A lot of car people tend to be. But in this car, I never feel rushed. I've been driving it around all day now. I did a little tour up the coast, similar roads to this one actually. And driving it around all day, you never feel rushed. You never feel like you have anyone to answer to, anyone to respond to, like you have to care what people think. This car is supremely comfortable, supremely quiet, and it just disconnects you from the rest of the world. Inside, you have your usual array of technology, or lack thereof. You have these. Nobody ever really seems to talk about them, but one of the interesting features on these Rolls-Royces, they still use them today. They have these temperature controls down in the center console that, instead of a temperature setting, which was really starting to come in the 90s, where you would just set a climate control temperature rather than just cold air, hot air, Rolls-Royce didn't do that. They have these little dials in the center. They're red, white, and blue. And you simply slide them some amount to determine how much you want air conditioning. You also notice that the AC controls, they have Econ, low, auto, high, and defrost. Down here in these controls you also have an interesting button. If you've seen other videos of this car, they will have talked about these, and the Rolls-Royces and Bentleys from this era all have this. There's a little button here with a picture that looks like it should be on your oil gauge. And what that button does is when you press it, it turns your fuel gauge into a mineral oil gauge, because as anyone who knows anything about these era of Rolls-Royce cars, everything is driven on a mineral oil system. Your suspension, your brakes, on some cars power steering. I don't believe this car is one of those cars, but that system basically is everything to control the car, aside from the engine, obviously. But everything that you would need to control it is handled by this mineral oil system, and if you run out of mineral oil, you got no brakes, no suspension, and possibly no steering in other cars. So you press this button, and you can check the levels this car is showing, beautifully topped up. You also have a button here with two horns on it. I won't demonstrate that for you now because I'm in traffic, but these cars were fitted with something called town and country horns, where there was a horn for if you were in the city, and one that was a little louder and a different note that would carry a little further for if you were out in the countryside and wanted to notify the staff that you were at your country estate. This is also from the era of Rolls-Royce, where the manuals would just say, "Have your man take the car for service," or "Have your man see the dealer," about anything that might need to be fixed on the car. You'll also notice, tragically, this book for the Turbo R doesn't seem to have the sufficient label for power, but if you go to the back of the manual, you will notice it makes no mention of the horsepower in the engine description. It has engine displacement, it talks a little bit about the turbo on this car, and a bunch of other figures, nothing about the horsepower or the torque. Also, I have been saying Rolls-Royce a lot this video. Yes, this is a Bentley Turbo R, but this was the era where Rolls-Royce and Bentley products were, more than kissing cousins at that point. They were essentially, the only difference is this car has a turbo and a different nose on the front and a different logo in the middle. That's it. Obviously now Rolls-Royce is BMW and Bentley is owned by Volkswagen. Talking about the Bentley name, Motor Trend called the Turbo R the first car in years to really earn that name and deserve it. And I don't have a lot of experience with the Bentleys prior to this car, but I can tell you from spending the day driving this around, I would be overjoyed if somebody said, "You need to drive this to Manhattan from Los Angeles. You got to do the reverse cannonball in this car, and you got to leave right now." Like I mentioned before, it's quiet, comfortable, as a true luxury car should be, but as a Bentley should be. When I stick my foot in it, which I can't do here for traffic reasons, but if I was able to, it would just surge away and wouldn't make much noise doing it. But it really does embody that idea of the gentleman's express that Bentley was known for back in the 30s in the WO days. Other impressions driving this car, every now and again I hear a car called a bank vault. This car is definitely a bank vault of a car. So we've talked a little about the sporting dynamics with the throttle response and the power, talked a little about the road holding and the steering feel and the suspension. One thing I haven't really talked about is brake feel, and it is bizarre on this car. They stop you. I've never once worried that they weren't going to stop this car, but the actual pedal feel is odd. Normally, we're used to some level of resistance and some force. This has very little, and it almost feels spongy, but thankfully I've only had to jam on the brakes once because somebody had pulled out in front of me. But even then, it bit hard, and the steering, when I had to swerve around him, did really do the trick. So, you know, hats off to Bentley for managing to build a car that doesn't throw you around or and manages to stop, which, with the mineral oil system, as I mentioned, it's a bit of a concern. I'm almost pulling up to about where I think I'm going to finish this video, but I think the last thing I want to discuss is the value for money on these cars, which to me is absolutely insane. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the sticker price on these was about $195,000, or again, today's money, that's $372,000, which, you know, about what a new Mulsanne would cost you. But today, you could pick up a Turbo R like this one, a nice one, for somewhere between $20,000 and $40,000, which is Honda Accord, Toyota Camry money. Am I saying you should choose this as a daily over one of those? No. Do not. These cars, well, they have a reputation for unreliability, and while a lot of that does come from the fact that these are frequently third and fourth cars for people, so they don't get driven as much as they should, and that with depreciation as it is, a lot of people will end up cutting corners because they can purchase this car at a $20,000, $30,000 buy-in, but not realize at the time that they're still buying into a car that costs the equivalent of $300,000 in its day. So, you know, not the car to get to commute to work in, though if you were bold and you were brave, I know I certainly would want to do my morning commute in this car. But I'd say overall, as a realistic premise for a just sort of a luxury car to go on a date night, just have a nice cruise as I have today, this car is one of the best cars you can get. Dollar for dollar, just an absolutely fantastic car. Alright, well, I have reached my stopping point here, so I think I'm going to leave you with that. This Bentley is a beautiful car. I absolutely adore it, and I would highly recommend to anybody out there watching this video, if you get the chance to drive one of these, absolutely do it. You will spoil yourself. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff. Keep an eye out because we have some pretty interesting videos to come. Take care.